we understand where the preprocessor fits in the overall compilation process in C, let's turn our attention to some of the specific steps performed by the preprocessor. As we shall see in the demos coming up ahead, these fall into three broad categories: removing comments from the source code, which is relatively simple; expanding macros and replacing them with their definitions. This one is a bit more complex; and finally, including code that ought to be conditionally compiled. Macros are a particularly interesting use case of the preprocessor, and as we shall see, there are broadly speaking two types of macros. Macros which are stand-in for constant values and macros which are stand-ins for functions. Both of these have their own use cases. If a function is defined as a macro rather than as a regular function, this leads to some improvement in the performance of our program at runtime. However, as we shall see, there are some potential pitfalls associated with the expansion of a macro into its defining code. There are 5 types of preprocessor directives that we will be working with in the demos that come up ahead. The first of these, which we've already worked with, is the hash include. This is simple enough, and it's a way for us to pull in header files which contain constants or function declarations that our code invokes. The next is the hash define. This preprocessor directive allows us to define macros, and a macro is a code fragment which performs a specific operation during preprocessing. This code fragment is literally going to be substituted in or spliced in by the preprocessor every time the macro appears in code. So macros are extremely literal. We will also be working with ifdef and hash undef directives. Hash ifdef checks whether a particular macro has been defined, and hash undef has a very specific way of undefining a macro. As the name hash ifdef would suggest, the preprocessor is able to evaluate conditions. And in keeping with this idea, there is a whole class of preprocessor directives: hash if, hash else, hash elif, and hash endif. All of these can be used to specify code for conditional compilation. Please note, however, that these are not control structures, because a control structure alters the execution of a program at runtime based on a particular condition. These rather are merely preprocessor directives. They govern what code gets sent to the compiler for compilation into the final executable. The final class of preprocessor directives that we will be working with are hash pragma directives. All of the other preprocessor directives that you see on screen now are effectively ways for the developer to communicate with the preprocessor. However, hash pragma directives are ways for the developer to communicate with and control the compiler and not the preprocessor. These hash pragma directives are compiled